Hello, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Let's check in with Stacy, see what's going on. Stacy.
Hey, what do you think the topic might be? I'm wearing a clue.
Van Gogh's paintings as he slowly went insane, eating his own paint in the fields somewhere in the south of France while creating unsung masterpieces that would eventually sell for hundreds of billions of dollars thanks to fiat money printing?
No, this is actually Andy Warhol print, but the gilet jaune, the yellow vest, that's in our conversation.
Just like gilet jaune meets Chanel. It's like gilet jaune Chanel. It's very chic. It's just chic. It's gilet jaune.
You know, we sit on the brink of more revolution, maybe perhaps a French spring or a French winter. This is 10 years after the financial collapse, whereby all of our governments around certainly the Western world and the central banks came together and determined that there was no cost that they would not bear to bail out the bankers. So now everybody's quite concerned about the fact that the blowback has come, finally after 10 years, is all the ordinary people, the bottom 99% who did not benefit from the money printing, they're starting to do a nod, quite similar to what you're doing. It's like they're on to their rulers and they're angry. Well, apparently the cost to appease them is too high. Macron's concessions set to blow out French deficit. France is on course to overshoot the European Union's budget deficit ceiling next year without new spending cuts after President Emmanuel Macron caved in to anti-government street protests. Macron announced wage increases for the poorest workers and a tax cut for most pensioners on Monday to diffuse discontent, leaving his government scrambling to come up with extra budget savings or risk blowing through the EU's 3% of GDP limit.
Well, let's reel back a little bit. Okay, 2008 crisis. It was a victimless crime, we were told, and that they were going to bail out the bankers, and they spent globally something like $16-17 trillion to do so, and now we have the blowback of that event, and the crisis never ended. It just was kicked down the road, and now it's being blowing out to the global insurrection against banker occupation, or GIABO, something we've been talking about for 10 years. It's now going global. The gilet jaune, the yellow vest movement, will go global. We'll see it all over the world. This is the Occupy Wall Street times 1,000. But let's talk about, what we've been saying over the years and why this is true. The way that the economy works globally, if you take a monetarist school, and that is the world we live in under neoliberalism, the global central banks find an interest rate that is appropriate to reward savers and to make credit creation possible enough to create new businesses, to create jobs and tax revenue to pay down deficits. And that naturalized rate of return tends to be around 4 or 5%. What happened in the 2008 crisis is that central banks got together and said, wait a minute, our friends, the bankers, need to get bailed out. The only way we can do that is if we artificially drop rates down to zero, near to zero, and effectively move all the money that's in pensions, all the money that's in savings, all the money that's in the pockets of workers, and we transfer it via this transfer mechanism of interest rate manipulation to our banking friends. They'll get bailed out. We bail out the creditors, but the rest of the world will have to pay. The rest of the world didn't really understand what's going on because they don't understand we live in this monetarist world. Well, 10 years later now, they are seeing the results. Inflation's creeping in, the cost of living is going higher than they can possibly afford, and they are now insurrecting all over the world. But let's talk about why this is true. Macron's a banker. He was put in there by the banking establishment to create the scenario to allow for this interest rate apartheid to continue. We all live in the Bantustan of artificially low rates for them, high rates for us, and now it's gilet jaune. It's game on.
So in the second half, you're talking to Michael Hudson. He's written a new book about debt. Another person who's written a book about debt is David Graeber, and he's also looked at the situation going on in the gilet jaune and the absence of the understanding and imagination of the elite class, the people who are supposed to be the intellectuals, who are supposed to explain this situation to us. Of course, what they are explaining, they're blaming Russia, of course, for the Gilets Jaunes protest movement. But here he's saying the yellow vests show how much the ground moves under our feet. If one feature of the truly revolutionary moment is the complete failure of conventional categories to describe what's happening around us, then that's a pretty good sign we're living in revolutionary times. He goes into two explanations for what we're seeing there. But the one I want to point to is the Cantillon effect, because he he sees that. He sees what is going on in the France and the Gilets jaunes in the yellow vest is about the Cantillon effect. You and I have covered this, and you've just touched on that, which is the central banks printing money. He said, in a financialized economy, only those closest to the means of money creation, essentially investors and professional managerial classes, are in a position to employ the language of universalism. As a result, any political claims as based on particular needs and interests tend to be treated as manifestation of identity politics, and in the case of the social base of the Gilets jaunes, therefore, cannot be imagined as anything but proto-fascist. So the intellectuals look at this. Rachel Maddow sorts will look at this. Their benefits of the free money that comes from the Fed into Manhattan. She lives in Manhattan. She's paid by bankers essentially because the ads taken out against her program and the military-industrial complex, the Lockheed Martin and Raytheon taking out ads against her thing. So they look at these people, and what you see is they blame Russia and they call them fascists, and you'll see that online. But I'm going to go in a little bit more once you respond to that about the Cantillon effect, and he actually puts it down to 1971, going off the gold standard.
The 5 richest zip codes in America surround America's central bank. That's a direct evidence of a Cantillon effect. They print the money, it goes to those guys in the neighborhood first. Why is Jeff Bezos moving into that neighborhood? Because he wants to get the Cantillon effect. 150 billion is not enough for him. He wants 300 billion, right? So that's a direct correlation and a direct ipso facto cause and effect. You see it geographically, it's obvious.
So how the elites got so divorced from reality and why they can't understand the world around them, why they continue to fail. Well, he says, since the U.S. jettisoning of the gold standard in 1971, we've seen a profound shift in the nature of capitalism. Most corporate profits are now no longer derived from producing or even marketing anything, but in the manipulation of credit, debt, and regulated rents. As government and financial bureaucracies become so intimately intertwined, it's increasingly difficult to tell one from the other. Wealth and power, particularly the power to create money, that is credit, also become effectively the same thing. Despite this, politicians and media commentators systematically refuse to recognize these new realities. For instance, in public discourse, one must still speak of tax policy as if they need any of this, and that it's no longer about money creation, that there's actually some sort of wealth creation happening.
That's the whole idea of the monetarist school of economics, is that you are managing or piloting the economy through the magic of central bank interventions by either buying money or selling money or manipulating interest rates one way or another. The fact is that in America, like Saudi Arabia, the working class is not needed. In Saudi Arabia, the reason you have 5,000 princes and wide-scale poverty is because anytime you need money, you just pump more oil. In America, similarly, you don't need a working class in America. You don't need the $3 trillion in taxes they collect. The American worker is not only deplorable, but they are confiscatable. They are get rid of them, because all you do if you need more money is to print more money. America's printing press is like the Saudi oil well.
He points out that the commentators, the media commentators, the likes of Rachel Maddow, the fact that they fail to talk about this Cantillon effect, that they fail to tell you how so-called wealth is created in the U.S., that it ensures the means of credit creation can never be democratized, i.e., why not next time, why not do QE for the people? Of course, they're not going to talk about that on MSNBC. They're going to talk about it on RT. We've talked about it. Our guests like Steve Keen have talked about it. David Graeber has talked about it. But again, since 2008, governments have been pumping new money into the system, which, owing to the notorious Cantillon effect, has tended to accrue overwhelmingly to those who already hold financial assets and their technocratic allies and the professional managerial classes. In France, of course, these are precisely the Macronists. Members of these classes feel they are the embodiments of any possible universalism. Their conceptions of the universal being firmly rooted in the market, or increasingly that atrocious fusion of bureaucracy and market, which is the reigning ideology of what's called the political center. Fusion of the markets with the government, with the elite. That's corporatism, which then in the 1930s became fascism, a more violent thing. But here he points out that this universalism, that they do feel some sort of divine, like they are somehow better than everybody else because they're wealthier, and they believe their own propaganda that this is a meritocracy. And they continuously condemn the bottom, those the 99% who always pay through the Cantillon effect, that those bottom 99% are alt-right, they're deplorables, they're fascists, they're proto-fascists, they project all the stuff. They call them fascists, when in fact what the elites have is closer to what is the actual definition of fascism, minus the the actual brown shirting thuggery and kneecapping.
Right. It's kind of like Mussolini meets Jim Jones of Jonestown. If you can print $100 million and buy a Van Gogh and stick it on a wall and then get your photo on the cover of Fortune magazine, you are a god. Did you work even 5 minutes for that? No, not in the sense that you've worked. As long as we have interest rate apartheid, as long as we live in the Bantustans of this reserve out in the middle of the boonies, expendable because our work and taxes are not needed, then we will be ever more consigned to the permanent underclass, and the forces of insurrection will continue to get stronger. The Gilets Jaunes movement is going global. Bankers are now rightfully seen as the enemy, full stop.
Well, certainly money creation will always basically make it impossible for you to climb up the ladder, and you become a national, in the media, you become the bad guy. You're the one that's painted as alt-right or deplorable or fascist. He says working people in this new centrist reality are increasingly denied any possibility of universalism since they literally cannot afford it. The ability to act out of concern for the planet, for instance, rather than exigencies of sheer survival, is now a direct side effect of forms of money creation and managerial distribution of rents. Anyone who is forced to think only of their own or their family's immediate material needs is seen as asserting a particular identity, and while certain identities might be condescendingly indulged, that of the white working class can only be a form of racism, they say.
Yeah, well, that's propaganda put out by the money printers. What the story here is that for 10 years we've been saying the story, and it's taken 10 years for people to realize it's not about a socialist revolution or a political conflict, and it's not an environmental threat, it's not an existential threat, it's a threat of central bankers and the people like Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon is the bin Laden of the 21st century.
I saw he recently actually was quoted as saying that he doesn't understand who all these people are that keep on following him around to public meetings and yelling at him from the audience.
That's exactly what bin Laden said when he was holed up in Pakistan next to a U.S. military base. Like, why is everyone following me? What's going on here? I just like to watch porno. Okay, well, we got to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Okay, this is coming out. You can pre-order this right now at Amazon and forgive them their debts. This is a masterpiece written by the master himself, Dr. Michael Hudson. Welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me back, Max.
I've been waiting for this book for a while. I see all the people in the back there, David Graeber, Ann Pertifor, Steve Keen, Paul Craig Roberts, they're all raving about this, and it's really a much needed book, and especially in the holiday season. I want to talk about chapter 2 here, Jesus' first sermon and the tradition of debt amnesty. In the first reported sermon Jesus delivered upon returning to his native Nazareth, he unrolled the scroll of Isaiah and announced his mission to restore the year of our Lord. Now, until recently, the meaning of this phrase was not recognized as referring officially to the Jubilee year, but breakthroughs in cuneiform research and a key to the Qumran scroll provide a direct link to that tradition. This linkage provides the basis for understanding how early Christianity emerged in an epoch so impoverished by debt and the threat of bondage that it was called the end time. So now you've been doing research into cuneiform, you've been looking at the tradition of debt forgiveness. We live in an era of the global debt, 400% debt to GDP. It seems like we're in end times.
Yes, it's what they would have called the end time.
Are we, barring the emergence of Jesus Christ and the second coming, what are we going to do?
Well, one of the things that the Babylonians who first developed the concept of the Jubilee year, the word was the same as in Hebrew. The Babylonian word for debt cancellation and Jubilee year was andararim. The Hebrew word was duror. And when the Leviticus laws introduced the Jubilee year to the Bible by the returnees from Babylon, the Jubilee year was word for word what the royal proclamations of Hammurabi and other Babylonian leaders were. And what the Babylonians realized, we actually have their mathematical models that they trained their scribes in. And the mathematical models used in 1800 BC in Babylonia were superior to those used today because they were very simple. They realized that finance was not part of the economy, but grew by its own mathematical laws. And scribes were asked to do two things. One, to calculate compound interest, which grew at the equivalent of 20% a year, doubling in 5 years, quadrupling in 10 years. They also had to project the growth of herds and agriculture, and they grew in an S-curve and tapered off. So for 2,000 years, every ruler of the Near East knew that debts tended to grow faster than the economy's ability to pay. And that became the principle of their economic policy. And what they did was say, when the personal debts, not the business debts, but we're talking about personal agrarian debt, sort of like student loans and credit card debt, grew so large that it would impair the debtor from paying the taxes or serving in the army, and in fact would lead him to run away, which was a big problem, that they'd have to cancel the debts, or else you'd end up looking like modern Greece after the austerity program. And if we would have had a free marketer, Milton Friedman would have gone back in a time machine and become the advisor to Hammurabi and said, no, let the market work its way, let the population become all debt servants and bond servants to the public collectors and the rich people, you would have had feudalism occurring 4,000 years earlier than it actually did. So the message for today is we know that the debts can't be paid because the debts grow faster than the economy. So if you don't write them down, one of two things are going to happen. Either you're going to have more and more people in the status of student debtors today and credit card debtors, and families that spend all of their wages over subsistence to the banks for interest, or you decide it's not worth sacrificing the economy just to pay the creditors. And the good thing about canceling the debts is not only to free the creditors, but is not only Hammurabi said, but as the Byzantine rulers said, the good thing about canceling debts is you wipe out the savings of the rich people. And the savings of the rich people, they're going to use it, they're going to overthrow us and make a free market economy. And I have the quotations in the books. They're going to try to take over the land and not pay the taxes, just like today. They didn't have offshore banking centers in Byzantium, but they simply didn't pay. And they hired their own armies to fight against the Byzantine rulers. And there was a military war over the debt issue, just as there was in Rome, classical Greece, and the late Bronze Age. So looking at history, you realize number one, that canceling the debts doesn't cause an economic crisis. It's the way to prevent an economic crisis. It's the way to preserve economies with people's heads above water. And once that stops, as it did in Rome, we know how Rome ended when it was the first place that didn't cancel the debts. It ended up in feudalism. So that's the model that I think economic analysis should start with.
Wow. And so let's just focus in on one specific metric, if you will. So ancient credit analysis, and you were a credit analyst actually on Wall Street. That's how you started your career. Right. You've been looking at credit in the economy and in the business world for decades. Yep. Now, you make a point there that is one that seems to hinge on this whole story, and that is that compounded rate of interest in the debt grows at a faster rate than the economy can grow at any possible rate to pay down that debt.
Yep.
Einstein called compounded interest the most destructive force in the universe, or one of the greatest forces in the universe. Here's a guy who was associated with the atomic bomb, and yet he thought compounded interest was incredibly destructive. But when you apply that to debt, you have this problem where it's growing at a pace that's you can't pay it off, and you end up with all these different problems that are associated with it. And so we live in an era today where, everyone in the elite, all the situations are basically repeated. In 2008, that would have been, as we've talked about on the show, the absolute prime point to do a debt jubilee, to bail out the debtors. Instead, the creditors were bailed out. Even Hank Paulson wanted to nationalize Citibank, but he was overruled by Obama, who insisted on bailing out Wall Street.
Well, remember, Obama had submitted the list of cabinet members to Citibank, to the bagman for Wall Street, Tim Geithner, for approval. So Citibank got to name Obama's cabinet, and Sheila Bair also wanted to take over Citibank because she said it was hopelessly incompetent and it was broke, and that it should be taken over. But Geithner and President Clinton's Treasury Secretary, who ran Citibank by that time, overruled him, and Obama then invited the bankers to the White House, and he said, "I'm the only guy standing between you and the mobs and pitchforks, but believe me, my loyalty is to you, the donor class, not to the voters. I'll deliver the voters to you," and that's what he did, and it's still what the Democratic Party is doing today. Both parties basically are saying what people want to hear, but in practice, they want to maintain the debt. And if you look at what the Council of Economic Advisors report, both under Trump and under Obama and under President Bush, they all forecast GDP is growing at compound interest. They say, here's the historical rate, as if GDP will automatically grow. What they don't forecast is debt growing at compound interest, and they don't realize that the GDP's going to grow slower and slower and slower as more and more debt service is used to pay the banks that are not going to relend the money to keep the economy going, but they're going to use it to indebt the economy even more. So housing prices are going to go up even more. Stock prices will go up, meaning stock yields will go down, bond yields will go down. So basically, by saving the banks, Obama undercut the pension funds, undercut the 401k savings plans, undercut people's ability to save for their retirement without turning their money over to Wall Street and getting taken by the Sharpies, as you have illustrated so often.
Right. So in biblical times, in ancient times, debt was something that occurred. People fell behind in taxes, and people that had, they're agrarians, they were farmers, yep. There was a catastrophic force majeure, crops didn't come in, and they accumulated debt. And through no immoral, failing of their person, they were simply part of an economy where debt is kind of erupted spontaneously, if you will. Right. And so what you're saying is that Jesus, as you point out in the book, this idea of the debt jubilee, to forgive the debt, economically, you do two very powerful things. You keep the farmers and the consumers going about their way without going into debt prison, and you disenfranchise the debt sellers, the debt mongers, the debt you might get into the whole biblical thing here, who are ruining the economy because, and you mentioned Milton Friedman there. So in modern times, Milton Friedman and the Margaret Thatcher era and the era of neoliberalization, they turned debt from a balance sheet item to something that was a growth item, that the faster companies could incur debt. The more you could incur debt, the faster we can securitize it and sell it to some other bank and create this daisy chain. And not only did debt become okay, it became the basis of the economy.
This was a historic change. Never in history did people think that the way to get rich was to go into debt. Down until, I'd say, the 1950s, the whole idea was to pay off the mortgage, not to owe anything, because you knew that once you you owed something, you'd tend to fall further and further behind, and you'd get on the debt treadmill. And Babylon knew that, Judah knew that, Rome and Greece knew that, and the idea that you can get rich by going into debt is obviously patter talk and a cover story for the banks and the bondholders that are selling debt. And it doesn't work, and yet that's not the center of the economics curriculum as it should be. What the debt problem, debt didn't appear in the whole economics curriculum all the time I worked through the PhD.
You know, Donald Trump was recently asked about the debt in the United States at $22 trillion, and he said, well, you know, I'm not going to be around much to have to deal with it. So it's just pushing that into the future. We only have about 30 seconds. I'm going to have to cut you off, and we're going to bring you back on a second segment. But Donald Trump obviously would not be featured as one of the good guys in the Bible.
Well, even when he did owe money, he didn't pay his debts to the banks, and no bank would lend to him at all. So you'd think he'd be friendly towards this, but
sure.
You know who his campaign contributors were.
All right, well, we'll pick this up in another segment. Thanks for being on this episode of the Keiser Report. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Hudson. The new book is called And Forgive Them Their Debts. It's an instant classic. You can pre-order it right now on Amazon. I highly recommend it. The book of the year. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.